Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present the Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome back to the Formed Book Club after our brief pause for Christmas season. We are continuing to discuss Thomas Howard's book, Chance of the Dance, and it's taking a little longer than we anticipated. And I think there's two reasons for that, maybe more, but there's at least these two in my view. One, it is a very thought-provoking book and therefore leads itself easily to discussion. But secondly, and maybe more consistent with the book itself, he is showing us how we really understand the meaning of things through images, through concrete images. And so it's very hard to kind of summarize what he's saying without quoting and talking about the image. It's like saying, well, let's discuss Macbeth. How would you summarize Macbeth? Well, you can try and summarize it, but you don't get Macbeth out of that. You get some abstract idea about Macbeth. Whereas his whole focus in this book is on poetic imagination as part of our lives and our way of recognizing meaning in things. So I think we can't not spend time on this if we're going to do it justice. But however, before we get this week, I want to prepare people for next week because we're going to be discussing Father Robert McTague's book, Real Philosophy for Real People. So we hope all you real people will tune in. The subtitle is Tools for Truthful Living. And I can't think of something more appropriate now. I was thinking, by the way, you people jump in if you want, because I may start going on and on here, but the guidance God has given us for living a flourishing and happy life are in the Ten Commandments as a core, and they go beyond that to the Beatitudes and so on. But there's sort of 5 areas where God tells us if you want to be happy and you want to be righteous, then you shouldn't steal, and you shouldn't kill, and you shouldn't covet your neighbor's wife or goods, and you shouldn't lie. I missed one here. Kill, lie, steal, covet your neighbor's goods and covet your neighbor's wife, and not to lie. And I think probably the most corrosive aspect of our culture is the 8th commandment, the lie, that we're surrounded by, inundated by information, by words, but many of which are false or misleading or ignore the truth or suppress the truth. So I think the idea of having tools for truthful living is very appropriate and very contemporary.
I would also say there as well, just on that, is that this, of course, being surrounded by lies is an inevitable consequence of relativism, because for a Christian, you can't use immoral means to a good end. But for a relativist, if the end is good, it doesn't really matter what means you use to get there. So they're quite happy to tell a lie in pursuit of a greater truth, which is why lies become part of the common currency.
Well, I would say not necessarily in pursuit of a greater truth, but in pursuit of their goal, because their goal is not necessarily greater truth.
I agree that what do they mean by truth? But I did put truth in inverted commas there.
Oh, we didn't see that. Okay. I didn't hear that. Okay. So shall we continue with chapter 5, Sublimity, soup cans, etc.
Well, first of all, you got to love a chapter that's titled that juxtaposes sublimity with soup cans. That's the first thing, and managed to alliterate at the same time. I've got something on the first page, and then maybe let Vivian say something. But at the end of the first paragraph on page 63 there, that it is by the clothing of an idea in the vividness of form, either concrete or ritual, that it appears as significant. And in other words, that it then can convey what it is or what it means to someone, something else. So at the absolute rock bottom of reality is this idea of the word being flesh, that the idea, whatever the idea is not actually conveyable, it's not revealed unless it's clothed in flesh. And it's that clothing in flesh, the vividness of form, as he calls it, which allows it to appear as significant, as signifying something which is communicable.
Right. That reminds me of something which has occurred to me. It's obvious, but I was thinking about it. He talks about the old myth where everything means everything, and the new myth, nothing means anything. Another word that's a synonym for meaning is signification. What does that signify? But when you say signify instead of mean, it points more clearly to the fact that things are signs. Signs point to something else, and not just some idea else, but something else. By the way, go ahead.
What he's doing in this chapter, where we left off last time, was poetry.
Right.
The use of words to bring form to ideas and showing the significance of even very common things, such as walking one step at a time. We spent a lot of time on that last time. In this chapter, he's talking about painting specifically, an art form that in fact uses images to make visible things that are invisible. If the painting is doing what painting is able to do in signifying human experience. And that's what this chapter is about. Very
good. You anticipated me. Well, more than that, I should have said at the beginning, but I didn't. So I'm glad you caught up, made that comment, because that's exactly right. This is a chapter on painting. The bottom of that page, 63, 3 lines up, he says, the old order with beatitude at the top and hell at the bottom, and all things ranged and arrayed in between, has evaporated with the advent of science, goes to supposition. Hence we are lost, alienated, disenfranchised, forlorn. The stuff of our world and our experience suggests not a pattern of glory, but nothing at all. And that, he kind of says the same thing, but in a little different way each time. But each way he says it is striking.
And the paradox there is, of course, that in pursuing empiricism, in other words, fact and fact alone, we end with insignificance. That the fact by itself conveys nothing.
Right, because the fact has to be interpreted in some way.
Right.
And the way we bring interpretation to things, one of the ways we bring interpretation to our experience is through art.
Right,
to give you the very first step of even looking at it. Because until you represent experience into some art form, you're not really paying attention to it. Right? So first to get that detachment from it, to look at it and go, oh, now I'm really seeing things about life that I just didn't see before. Never mind think about. I first have to see it to think about it.
I'm not following. Can you give us an example of that?
Well, last week we talked about the little nursery rhyme, which way to Lunchtown, 1 foot up, 1 foot down, right? And it's not until you actually think about walking that it's something you do every day. But until it took the form of art, in this case, a little rhyme, is something that you just do without even thinking about it.
Okay.
So the thing that art does for us is put it in front of us in some form that now you can go, oh, yes, that's what walking is like. And now that I'm looking at it and thinking about it, and it's playing like a tune in my head, how does this speak to me about life, about meaning, about the purpose of life?
Okay, so that
Life is a journey, and so on, and so all these things that spin off from just contemplating walking.
so if you look at all the merely enormous number of facts that go into every hour of our lives, every motion, every what our eyes see, what our ears hear. I mean, how do you select out what is significant, what means something? Well, yeah, okay, so poetry will do that and make you realize.
So does painting. The artist.
And painting too, yeah.
And which is what this chapter. So now the artist is taking something in his experience and focusing on that. And the artistic vision, of course, is not just what he puts in the picture, but all the things he leaves out of the picture. And so now you're getting the artist's vision of the thing, and now you're looking at it in this fresh way, and now thinking about it, which you might not have done before.
You think if I had someone do a portrait of me, I could find some significance?
There's significance in everything. Isn't that what we're all?
Oh, that's true. Oh, that's consoling. I just want to say on page 64, the two artists he's talking about here in this chapter, at that new paragraph in the middle, are the 17th century Fleming Vermeer and the 20th century American Warhol, Andy Warhol. And so if we were doing this merely as a video podcast, we would have Thomas, our great technical person here, put up images of the two pieces of art that will be discussed in this chapter. But since this is mainly being listened to and not watched, I encourage people to go to the internet and, get that image so you can see exactly what Thomas Howard is referring to here.
Well, I have at the bottom of page 67, if other people are not have things before that.
Well, I guess before we go to page 67, what I would like to say is that Vermeer and Warhol are both very representative of their age. And he touches on this somewhat directly, somewhat obliquely, but I think it's worth pointing out that in choosing these two artists to juxtapose them with each other, he is choosing two very representative artists. And that's why it's so interesting to compare them.
And I think that's within the scope of his purpose here in the book of the old myth and the new, trying to take two different eras and two different sensibilities and showing how they're represented in art and what that means.
Although I would add that Vermeer is somewhat of a transitional representative of between the so-called old and the so-called new, and that is because prior to his era, the subject matter of art was more sacred material. And he is part of this new movement in art to now start painting the ordinary. And this was considered revolutionary at the time.
Okay.
And it was also far less allegorical. I mean, earlier art overtly signified. There was an allegory within the vision presented, whereas Vermeer is purportedly just showing an event, if you like, a pre-photograph photograph, right? Someone pouring a jug of milk. And it itself doesn't say anything beyond itself, except, of course, we are invited, I would say. So there's a signification which is much more subtle than a crude sort of allegory. But we're looking at the beauty, right, of the form. We're looking at the texture. In that particular painting, I'm thinking of the fact that the artist managed to get the texture, the coarse texture of the peasant woman's clothes visible, right, in two dimensions. And so we are invited, we are still being transfigured, if you like, by this engagement with the beautiful, even though there's no overt allegorical connection to something beyond itself.
That's right. A musical comparison to this is Mozart's Marriage of Figaro. You know, the operatic form up until that work had the gods and the hierarchical order with the gods up here and then the emperor and so on and so on. And here Mozart, in a very revolutionary way, writes an opera about a common man marrying a common woman. And it was considered almost blasphemous to take this high art form and invert this hierarchy and in fact make the people look at the top of the hierarchy not so wonderful and grand, but to elevate the common person. So this movement is happening in art in this period, and it is something kind of in between the older art forms and what they were doing with them and these newer bits of subject matter. I mean, it's an important thing to understand, and I think Howard, you know, he does just touch it briefly. I can't find the place in this chapter, but I think it could have been explained a little more, actually, but it wouldn't have been quite to his purpose if he had.
Right, that's not the point. It's not an art. It's not a book of art history, so it
That's
would be
right.
tangential.
Wow, that's thank you. That's enlightening. That comment. I appreciate that. So Vermeer is 17th century. So that's well after the Renaissance. I mean, the Renaissance tended to bring back or have reborn kind of classical types of art and figures, which precisely did include this hierarchy where the gods and the king and so on were the main characters. Whereas now we're post-Renaissance, I guess, and beginning the modern period.
That's
where,
right.
Okay.
Yeah, it's humanism. Basically, you know, let's look at the human form. Let's know what the human person does as a way of understanding who we are. So it's actually it's stripping some of the metaphysics from reality, which is problematic. But what I said though, however, you look at the beauty of a Vermeer painting, it's similar to looking at the beauty of a sunset, right? That there's no overt allegory there, but the beauty itself speaks.
Yes. So I'm not in pointing out its historical context. I'm not finding fault with it at all. I'm simply saying, though, that Vermeer is part of an artistic movement that has, art and philosophy and these things. They're all interrelated in their time, and his art also is reflective of the ideas of the time, the ideas of the Protestant Reformation, the ideas of Enlightenment, humanism, and so on. And I'm not saying that this is not in any way to criticize his art at all. It's simply to just say it too is reflective of its time in the same way that Warhol, when we get to him, is very reflective of his time.
Okay, and then don't get defensive, Vivian, because we are two males to one female only because we know that one female is she's more than two males. So, but
You're very kind.
What? How would you? What do you say the relation is between the Vermeer Warhol comparison and his constant theme of old myth versus new in this book?
Well, I would say that in Vermeer's time, even though these ideas were seeping their way through philosophy and religion, and this is complete, I'm not a scholar, this is my own speculation, but I think people still believed that reality and beauty and truth were transcendence that were real. I don't think they completely adopted the kind of subjectivism that we see now, and this even though maybe logically some of these ideas are going to work out over time to the subjectivism and the radical autonomy that we have now, but I think that people could still appreciate the glories of reality, and that there was such a thing as reality.
Yeah, if I may speak to that, I mean, the actual form of Vermeer is realism, In other words, that he actually uses a realistic technique to convey. He wants to give a real image of the thing he's painting. So he's engaged with reality. Whereas to what extent are the painters of the 20th century engaged with reality? So I think that's part of it. And I also think, as regards Thomas Howard's purpose here, is that he's not. This is not a theological polemic, right? It's basically it's philosophical work, and he doesn't. If he didn't want to give an early example of something over, Madonna and Child or something, because once you do that, you're bringing in a whole theological overlay, and he just wants to talk about the dance or the chants. And I think in choosing Vermeer, he could talk about the dance without overlaying it with religion, and that's why I think he probably deliberately selected, for want of a better word, a secular artist and a secular work of art.
But what's more real than a can of Campbell's tomato soup?
Okay, and that's exactly where I was going to go next. And see, Warhol also is looking at reality. I don't even know why I'm doing that. It's not this. It's just reality. Soup cans are part of modern, mass-produced, consumerist reality. We have soup cans in our cupboards or cans of something in our cupboards. And so Warhol, he is being cheeky. There's no question. His life is fascinating. He was the son of Slavic immigrants to the Pittsburgh area. His parents were devout Byzantine Catholics. Warhol, by the way, received a church funeral and buried in a church yard with his parents.
And in his later life, by the way, spent quite a lot of time just sitting quietly in front of the Blessed Sacrament in Catholic churches.
He did. He went to he had and he also suffered from a horrible illness, this St. Vitus dance. Talk about chance or the dance. I don't think Howard maybe that's just one of these strange coincidences. St. Vitus dance is this disease where you lose control all over your neurological impulses in your legs and your arms, and all these things twitch in uncontrollable ways. I'm sure as a boy he suffered terribly, not only from this disease, but from the isolation that it caused him, because he couldn't go to school. And I'm sure if he did go to school, he was bullied mercilessly and all the rest of it. So the man is a very complicated, interesting character. And he was a talented artist from his youth, and his working class father saw to it that he got a professional art education, but he was a commercial artist. So he made his living making graphics for newspapers and magazines. He was very successful at this. So this turning to soup cans and mass producing even a mass-produced item, because he did these in silkscreen techniques and so on, where he could produce multiple copies. And there's a bit of cheek going on here. There's a bit of, he made some famous one-liners, like, "I'm a deeply superficial person," is classic. "Art is whatever you can get away with," is another. I mean, he knows what he's doing.
Yeah, I would like to, if I can maybe add to this, but also by way of maybe trying to progress beyond this. I'm quite happy to forsake my other highlighted comments in chapter 5 and leap to the final few sentences.
No. Let's we're not.
Well, we can go back farther, but that pertains to the soup cans. So I want to go to the end of the chapter, even if you want to go back.
Okay.
All
right.
So I want to not take issue, but maybe go beyond what Thomas Howard says in his final sentences on page 76. This is the common stuff of your experience, O 20th century.
Where on that page are you?
Oh, sorry. It's the final few sentences. So 6,
okay,
7
I got it.
Bottom. This is the common stuff of your experience, O 20th century. Soup cans. Not soup cans romanticized, or soup cans abstracted, or soup cans gilded. Just large, intransigent cans. How about that for your art? You've got to come to terms with the brutal actualities of life. A soup can is a soup can is a soup can, and not St. Michael and all angels, as other epochs thought it might be. That's all fine. I have no problem with any of that. But I would also like to suggest that there is an element of cheekiness, to use Vivian's words, but also I think satire
Yes.
in what Andy Warhol's doing here. Because the thing about the soup can, of course, it's not a work of art. It's made by a machine, right? It's machine made. It's not manufactured in the older sense of the word. It's not handmade, right? It's made by a machine. It's mass produced. It's not a work of art. It's a work of technology. So in presenting us with a work of technology as a work of art, is actually, if you like, juxtaposing things that violate each other. And I think there's a deep work of satire work there as well, which is inviting us to go deeper into the artificiality of modernity.
And I think you're absolutely right. And when my son, who's a painter, that's his training and everything. When he's painting a landscape, let's say, and there on the beach is a power plant, or there in his line of view is a telephone pole, or whatever. He has this conundrum of, do I paint that in because it's there? Can I make that thing beautiful? Or do I leave it out, or what? And I have to say that sometimes he's actually succeeded in making the power plant as part of the vista he's looking at beautiful, or parked cars beautiful, or whatever. I mean, I think some artists do see a kind of challenge in these things are now part of our experience. And what do I do with them as an artist? It's a serious question.
Well, I can go back to 67 if you
Go
want.
ahead, go back.
Okay, so at the bottom of page 67.
Okay,
said,
well, I have something at the top, okay?
Please.
So I'll just do this in the sense that I think it's an interesting remark he makes, and it helps us to understand what he's doing here. He talks about sensibility. He says, sensibility is an elusive matter, and it is a word that one thinks of more in connection with the 18th century than with our own, since it was a popular word then. It denotes something like the consciousness, the frame of mind of a given era, but not exactly these. It has to do with taste too. It arises eventually from the whole pool of presuppositions that lies at the bottom of everything that contributes to the era, and that nourishes the particular set of responses to experience that marks the era. So I think that's a good working definition, I think, which helps us understand what he's doing here in juxtaposing Vermeer and Warhol. Go ahead to the bottom, Joseph.
I think it is, but I would like to add a distinguo, because Jane Austen, of course, who was of that age at which he speaks, or just after, in Sense and Sensibility, juxtaposes those two words to talk about the difference between sense, in other words, reason, and sensibility, which is a feeling about things. And she's in some ways is reacting against romanticism, which has actually put feeling ahead of reason. And she, being ultimately an Aristotelian, can see the problem with that. So I do think there's another aspect of sensibility, which is, he mentions the word feeling somewhere in here, but he talks about it, I think, in a way which goes beyond that. And I want to keep that in mind.
Okay.
So at the bottom here, what is it about a poster of a stern Uncle Sam pointing his finger and wanting you that appeals to one generation, and about a poster of Allen Ginsberg costumed in grotesque parody of that same Uncle Sam that appeals to another generation? And he says it is a matter of sensibility, all right, which does actually, suggest that sensibility is something which is relative, right? Not something which is real in an essential sense of the word. So we get here, I think, a connection between philosophy, that if the philosophy changes, in other words, the understanding of the real changes, the sensibility would change also. Sensibility is ultimately subject to sense, is what I'm trying to say.
All right.
Yeah, sensibility has to do with our emotional reaction to things. And it's true that how we react emotionally is influenced by our era, our surroundings, are the things that we've been experiencing from childhood, that we react emotionally in some ways and others. And when we have these periods of tremendous changes going on, I mean, modern living with technology and factory production of everyday things and industrialization and all these things, these have brought about huge changes in the way.
I would just suggest, by way of a caveat, that we mustn't become too environmentalist. In other words, we're just a product of our environment. That I would say that our emotions are actually connected to our understanding of reality. And the reason that we react emotionally in the way that we do in our times is not because of mass production or whatever. It's because we live in a relativistic age where if anybody attacks what I feel, they're attacking me personally, because there's no objective reality beyond me. So I do think the emotion is subject to our understanding of reality.
I think so. That's
And
what you
it
just
is
said.
also pardon?
That's what you just said, I thought.
I
Vivian.
said it's well, it's subject to all of these things. And so it's also subject to this Uncle Sam poster that he's talking about.
Exactly.
Okay, let's look at that reaction to that Uncle Sam poster during a time of patriotic feeling.
Exactly. 1776 is our founding. You look at that poster and you're moved by it. 1619 Project, where everything is based on slavery and horrible things and oppression. You look at that and you want to, it's grotesque.
Well, and you know, at the time that this Uncle Sam image is being turned into grotesqueries is during the Vietnam War.
Exactly.
So here is patriotic feeling at an ebb, and anything suggesting patriotic feeling is considered disgusting. And so now you can say, Joseph, that, well, but with your sense, you can now evaluate those reactions with other information coming in. You can think about it. Is that reaction justified to that? Or is that, but that's like a secondary movement, you know, your first movement on an emotional level.
You're jumping ahead of me. I believe that your emotional knee-jerk reaction is a consequence of your preconceptions that are based upon your philosophy. So I'm not talking about you step back and say, I've got this sensibility, I'm now going to make sense of it. I think your sensibility is a consequence of the sense that you have of things. And if the sense you have of things is nonsense, your emotion will be the equivalent.
But I would argue that as in your formative years, you're not even aware of all the things that are working you over. I mean, when I think about my own flirtation with communism and living in communes and leftism and activism and all these things, you know, I wasn't even aware of whatever philosophical presuppositions I'd been taught since kindergarten that were working their way out in my emotional life. It wasn't until I got the intellectual maturity and, thank God, started reading great minds and great books, and now I had something to work with and sort out, you know, the bad ideas from the better ideas.
Vivian,
and so on.
The emotion does not precede the reason. What preceded the reason was the immaturity. In other words, your emotional responses were a consequence of your immaturity. Once you gain maturity, you can engage with reason, you then changed your understanding of reality, and your emotional responses also changed.
Yes,
so it's not that the emotion precedes reason, it's that your immaturity precedes reason, and your emotional responses as an immature person, a baby, for instance, right?
Yes,
is going to respond
that
very differently from someone else.
But that immaturity got played upon by the, you know, who were my teachers? What was I being taught? We're being played upon by things without our awareness of them.
If I can just be deliberately playing devil's advocate here, and it's not geared at you, actually. This is
You
geared
love
at
it.
What we
yeah,
just
no, it's fine. It's fun.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's not directed. It's directed what we've just been talking about. I would argue that both of those works of art we've just been talking about, Uncle Sam and Allen Ginsberg's parody of Uncle Sam, are actually works of propaganda.
They are.
Or are actually designed to play upon the emotions, and particularly the emotions of young people. So I would
Yes.
even say, though, because I'm not going to argue about the rights and wrongs of 1776 because I'll be outnumbered by all sorts of people. But what I will, but what I will say is that the jingoism. I'm talking about World War One, right? The sort of jingoism that marched people off to the trenches. There was a very quickly a backlash against that sort of jingoism. So the Allen Ginsberg parody of Uncle Sam. I don't promote the hippie nihilistic background of the anti-Vietnam protests, but I do think it's good to have a corrective to knee-jerk emotional jingoism.
I agree with you. And that's interesting because that does bring us back to Warhol. Because interestingly enough, in addition to soup cans, he also made, for example, posters of Mao and Liz Taylor and Marilyn Monroe and so many other, Liza Minnelli, so many other people that had reached sort of celebrity status that Warhol saw as having this propaganda use. In the case of the movies and starlets and things like this, their images are now to get you to go to their movies. In the case of Mao, who's posting up his images all over China, he's trying to run a mass movement and create. And so again, Warhol, in taking this substance and making art out of it, if that's what you want to call what his works are. I like to call what he does art, but some people don't. Again, he is looking at mass culture and advertising, propaganda. This is what he's taking into a studio and churning out works of art, getting us to look at. I think there's a kind of genius to it myself.
I want to, we've kind of gone over our limit we tried to establish for ourselves, but I think on page 74, the bottom there, the new paragraph, there's something you may draw this together. He says, the artist under the old myth, his world was an image of the eternal. That is, it was a pattern of appearances organized and shaped by the eternal word to exhibit the pattern of the eternal. And so you can see that in a Vermeer painting of a real person. You can't see that in a Warhol painting of a soup can because there's an intermediary there between the soup can and the eternal, and that's the manufacturer of the soup can and the soup. But the soup can itself is 2 steps removed from the eternal, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The only thing I would say is that it would be perceiving the real presence in the presence of its real absence. In other words, that you present something which is so absent, where the real and the beautiful and the good and the true are so absent that there's a vacuum that's presented that you actually want to fill with what's not there.
Well, this is good. This is fascinating to me, and I really appreciate it. And I think we should, go out and get, if you don't have it already, Father McTague's book, Real Philosophy for Real People, Tools for Truthful Living, is we will, God willing, if the world continues long enough, we'll get there. Thanks, everybody, for watching or listening. God bless you all. See you next week at the Formed Book Club.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Formed Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.